Okay, hello, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Raymond Karam, and I'm the Chief Program and Development Officer here at AGSIW. Thank you all for joining us today for this webinar looking at the prospects for a green recovery in the Gulf states. This program is part of a wider initiative at AGSIW looking at how Gulf societies can best emerge from the coronavirus pandemic. We have a few upcoming programs too that you can find on our website, agsiw.org, and please sign up if you would like to our newsletter on the website, and you'll get regular notifications of upcoming programs. Today we have a global audience joining us with over 250 registered attendees tuning in from all around the world, and we have a fantastic lineup with some of the foremost experts on this topic. First, we have our colleague and friend, Dr. Aisha Al-Sarihi, who is currently a research associate at the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center in Riyadh, and the coordinator for the T20 Climate and Environment Task Force. Aisha was formerly a visiting scholar with AGSIW and is now a non-resident fellow who contributes to our research on a regular basis. Her areas of interest include political economy of environmental sustainability, energy policy, renewables, and climate policies, with a focus on the Arab region. She holds a PhD from the Center for Environmental Policy at Imperial College London and an MSc and a BSc with distinction in environmental science from Sultan Qaboos University. Mary Luomi is a policy-oriented social scientist with 15 years of experience with think tanks, academia, and consulting, and best known for her work on climate change policy in the Gulf. She has worked for leading sustainable development and foreign policy research institutions like the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, International Institute for Sustainable Development, Georgetown University, and the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Most recently, she led a research program at the Emirates Diplomatic Academy on Energy, Climate Change, and Sustainable Development. She holds a PhD in Middle Eastern Studies from Durham University and an MSSC in International Politics from the University of Helsinki. Grzegorz Peszko is a lead economist in the Global Platforms team of the Environment, Natural Resources, and Blue Economy Practice Group of the World Bank, where he leads analytical and advisory services on economics of climate change mitigation, plastic pollution prevention, air pollution, changing wealth of nations, and macroeconomic and fiscal aspects of sustainability. And last but not least, our moderator and our good friend, Samantha Gross. Samantha is a fellow in the Cross Brookings Initiative on Energy and Climate with more than 20 years experience in energy and environmental affairs. She has been a visiting fellow at the King Abdullah Petroleum Center, Petroleum Studies and Research Center, where she authored work on clean energy cooperation and on post-Paris climate policy. She was director of the Office of International Climate and Clean Energy at the US Department of Energy. Prior to that, she was director of integrated research at IHS-SERA. She holds a BS in chemical engineering from the University of Illinois, an MS in environmental engineering from Stanford, and an MBA from the University of California at Berkeley. We have relied on Samantha repeatedly to lead some of our conversations around energy and climate change, and we're grateful that she's joining us again today. Unfortunately, our fifth speaker, Rabia Farouki from IRENA, is no longer able to join us this morning because of scheduling issues, but we hope to have her with us for a follow-up program in the future. A disclaimer before we get started, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website tomorrow. A reminder to our audience, you are in listen-only mode, but you'll be able to ask your questions through the Q&A function in Zoom, or you can also email us at info@agsiw.org. You can follow the conversation and comment also on Twitter at Gulf States Inst. With that, Samantha, over to you.
Thank you very much, Raymond, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. Good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be. I'd like to start our discussion this morning with Mary and start us with where we are right now and where we've been with respect to economics and COVID. Where do the GCC countries stand today in their efforts against the coronavirus, both their emergency responses to the virus and their economic responses to the economic dislocation that it has brought about?
Well, first of all, good morning and good afternoon, good evening to everybody. And thanks again for the Arab Gulf States Institute for the invitation. And it's great to be in such excellent company. Thank you, Samantha, for the opening question, which is a good one. I agree that I think it's useful to look at the country's COVID response in the two phases. We're pretty much still in a rescue phase, an emergency phase, perhaps starting to come out of it. But what will be next is the economic recovery phase, which I think is going to be the main emphasis of today. But I think it's good to let's first look at how countries have been faring so far. And I'll do that through the 3 pillars of sustainable development, briefly. Economic being the first one. All the GCC countries have put in place pretty sizable stimulus packages. For Oman and Bahrain in May, these amounted to about 30% of their GDP. They've come mostly in the form of loans, loan reliefs, cuts in fees from government, cuts in fees and taxes from government services, and salary payments for nationals. And it should be stressed, of course, that the GCC countries, given that they are very diverse, they're in very diverse levels also of vulnerability to the crisis. A big factor, obviously, is their hydrocarbon wealth divided by their population. And lower oil revenues are complicating, obviously, the economic response, even as we speak. There's lots of cuts ahead. And there's some indication that government entities, in some cases in the UAE, might be asked to reduce their budgets by up to 50%. So on the other hand, in terms of opening up the economies, that's a sort of different picture. It's been quite varied. And even within the UAE, we've seen very different approaches. Dubai has been very eager to open up the economy, whereas Abu Dhabi, which has a lot more oil wealth, has been less in a rush. Then moving to the social, there's been a big emphasis on social safety networks for nationals. In my interpretation, there's been a bit less support, or quite meager support, to the private sector. We've heard, for example, the hospitality sector demand for a lot more support. They're really in a survival mode, as they've said it. There's plenty of reports that wages have been cut across the private sector, but also in government-owned companies, in airlines, and real estate developers. And obviously those that have been made redundant, who are not nationals, have no social security, and apart from being entitled to COVID-related healthcare, which is obviously a good thing, which has led to then what I call the GCC effectively outsourcing its employment. And according to some estimates, up to 3.5 million people might leave the GCC by the end of the year because of unemployment. And that would amount to 6% of the population, which is a pretty high share. Some see this as an opportunity. There's been some rhetoric in the press saying, well, this is great because now we can accelerate our nationalization policies. But others feel that this might really hit hard the economy in the long term in terms of the economic infrastructure that's being lost now, the consumer spending, and also the human capital. Then finally, environment. As anywhere in the UAE, where I'm based myself, improved air quality got some attention, and so did the litter caused by disposable gloves and face masks. But overall, officially, apart from the former climate change minister, officials have not spoken really about sustainable or green recoveries here in the region yet. Emissions and air quality improvements, of course, are temporary, as in anywhere, because they're not the causes are structural. And so what has been also missing, I think, so far is a debate or the reflection on the opportunities that a change in trajectory such as a green recovery could offer. Which takes me to my final point on the sort of economic responses, which I think overall are still very largely to emerge. We haven't seen a lot of announcements yet on where the recovery policies would be taking the region. But overall, in terms of how the Gulf states have been faring on sustainable development, we did a study late last year where we measured SDG, Sustainable Development Goal performance of the GCC countries on 105 indicators, and we concluded that they are about 60 to 66% on the way to achieving the SDGs. So there's still a lot of way to go, a lot of opportunities there. So in sum, the health response has been pretty laudable. This is a region that has more than 50% of the population comprised of expatriates. That's an incredible effort or an incredible result that the virus has been kept under control as well as it has. But so far, there's been less emphasis on social inclusion and even less on the environment. So if I were asked to make an assessment right now, where are we going? I would say this points towards an aim to continue business as usual, which we of course know is not sustainable in the long term. But I hope that this webinar will prove me wrong.
Thank you very much. And your talk about the lack of attention to environment really leads into my next question, which is for Aisha. Are the GCC countries in general beginning to consider green recovery packages? And what are the opportunities and the challenges of bringing green issues into the economic stimulus packages as countries seek to emerge from the economic dislocation that the virus has caused?
Well, thank you very much, Samantha, and thanks to Mary also for the insightful remarks. I also would like to thank the Arab Gulf State Institute for holding this event. I think it is a timely and relevant discussion. It is always a great pleasure to be back to the AGSIW, although this time it's virtual. So yeah, I think there are three elements on the question. So I would like to start talking about the opportunities, and then I would talk about the challenges. So if I take a few steps back and just to put my answer into perspective. So, so the COVID-19 has presented a double shock for the economies of the Gulf Arab state because of the high economic reliance on the oil export revenues. So on the one hand, the lockdown measures that have been implemented, they disturb the local businesses and the governmental activities. And on the other hand, we have observed how the global lockdown measures have disturbed the global demand for the oil and how that has been translated into a historic decline in the oil prices. And for the Gulf Arab state, that has led to limitation on the revenues that comes from the oil exports, although this have been the situation even before the COVID-19. So with that and with the very restrictions in the physical resources, and if we look at the measures, the policy measures that have been undertaken so far, and as Mary has mentioned, they are mainly focused on health and on the social and the economic sectors. Well, indeed, this should be the case at this time of the crisis. And now, today we are speaking about a green recovery. And I think the question that might arise, and I have been asked this question, how come are we advocating for green investments at the time we have physical constraints and at the time of a crisis? For me, I think the question here is more about what are the missing opportunities? What will be the missing opportunities if we don't allocate some of the physical resources into the green investments? And although I don't have really specific data and information for the Gulf Arab states, there are studies that have been conducted, and one of them is the one that have been most recently widespread by the Oxford, published and by the Oxford Institute, sorry, it's university. So this study emphasized on how the green recovery could actually lead to economic growth as well as job creation as effectively or more than if we do the recovery without factoring the green investments. And to be more also specific and to give an example, there are also studies that showed that in terms of renewable energy and in terms of the energy efficiency, if you spend $1 million in renewable energy and the energy efficiency, you are more likely to create 3 to 5 more jobs compared if you spend the same amount of money on the fossil fuels. Now, again, I have this data, but it's, again, I don't have data specific for the Gulf Arab states. But what I can see from this, I can see with the economic growth and the creation of jobs, and as Mary said, there's an employment issue in here within the Gulf Arab states. So these outcomes are pretty much in line with the economic diversification ambitions, which are in place across the Gulf Arab states. So this is one of the opportunities that I can see. And another opportunity I also would like to bring here is there is an opportunity actually to address two crises simultaneously. The COVID-19 crisis and then the climate change. Now, although the COVID-19 have happened, the impacts of the climate change are still there. They are not posed by the COVID-19. So whatever actions that we are taking today, although they are going to help finding out solutions in the short term, the consequences can be felt in the long run. And so we shouldn't, actually, although we are in crisis, we shouldn't pause our action on climate. And for the Gulf Arab states, the climate change presented challenges for both the oil and the non-oil economic sectors. So for the non-oil economic sectors, we see the high temperature, the reduced rainfall, and we also have been seeing the extreme events that are hitting the region more frequently in the last few years. So, and in terms of how the climate change is impacting the oil sector, I think what the COVID-19 have shown us, I think COVID-19 has brought to us a snapshot on what it could look like in the future if the energy transition has been accelerated in order to cut greenhouse gas emissions and reduce the fossil fuel consumption. I think we can see a live picture of what could happen if we don't take action now. And also, I think what the COVID-19 has shown us how important it is to have a diversified production base economy, so that we can have a resilient economy in the time of the crisis. So, so again, I think we are pretty much talking about how the green investments are going to actually boost the economic diversification. Another point I would like also to talk about, so it's again depending on, or if we also look at the global picture and whether the other countries are considering the green recovery. So, well, the global picture is not as bright as we expect. So one of the studies by the Bloomberg, it shows that the investments that are allocated to green recovery, they are less than 1% from the total investments. And however, I can see there are signals of optimism here. So there are countries that have pledged to consider the green investments in their economic recovery measures, including, for example, the EU, Italy, Spain, Germany, France, for example, South Korea, and the UK, I think. So again, depending on the speed of the economic diversification, the energy transition and the speed of the implementation of these green recovery measures, what I see for the Gulf Arab states, if they take an action now and invest in the green options, then we can also help in diversifying the export profile. So here's also another opportunity to be competitive in a future energy market where the oil is not the main commodity for the competitiveness. In terms of the second part of the question and the challenges, I'll try to be quick here, but I can reflect on a study that has been published most recently We published a study with Dr. Michael Mason most recently on the climate policy integration in the Gulf Arab states, and we focused on Oman and the UAE. And we examined what are the main challenges for climate policy integration. So we have done this study way before COVID-19. So even when the COVID-19 was not there. But I think the findings of that studies really apply also to the current situations. So the first challenge we found was related to the data and information that are available, which are related to the climate change. And with interviews with the stakeholders, both in Oman and in the UAE, what we found and what many stakeholders have emphasized on that there isn't enough research and or research-based evidence that can inform the policymakers when it comes to the climate change and how to align climate change into the economic development and something like what are the co-benefits. The other challenge is related to the institutional structures and the governance of the climate-related issues. So although the ministries of the environment and climate change are playing a significant role in addressing climate-related issues, but because climate-related issues are cross-sectoral and they require a lot of coordination between ministries and the different departments, so many stakeholders have emphasized that it is the challenge is we need more improvement in terms of the coordination between the different sectors and the ministries and the departments. The third challenge is more about the physical and the human resources. So in the Gulf Arab states, we have two groups, the wealthy states and the less wealthy states. So in the wealthy states, so the physical resources and the limitation of the resources is not an issue. It is more about the allocation of the resources. So it's more about the political will. But for the less wealthiest countries, although there could be a political will, but then the limitation of the physical resources is an issue so I think it's also the same case for the green recovery at the time of COVID-19. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to pull a bit on the economic diversification thread and bring in Grzegorz. We hear a lot about economic diversification and the importance of that to GCC countries. But in the environment that we're seeing today, does it make that economic diversification harder because of the difficult economic conditions and having a lot of other priorities to deal with? Or is it an easier sell now because it seems more urgent in the current situation and the possibility of, say, peak oil demand is suddenly looking more possible than it did 6 months to a year ago? Can you expand upon the degree of difficulty of the economic diversification and where the various Gulf countries are?
Okay, thank you, Samantha, and thank you, colleagues from the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington for inviting me here. I need to make a standard disclaimer that all the views I express here are my own. They don't represent the World Bank. And nonetheless, I've been working quite a lot in the Gulf countries in the recent years, and your question is very intriguing and very relevant to some of the work that we have done recently. So, does it make it more difficult or more easy to diversify in this difficult post-COVID environment? So I think recessions never makes any serious economic transformation easier, for obvious reasons. However, as we have learned from our Chinese colleagues, from their language, crisis means threats and also an opportunity. And the crisis response measure through aggressive fiscal policy is an opportunity to shift economic structure beyond business as usual and redirect it into a more sustainable trajectory. When it comes to low oil prices, the story is even more interesting because actually low oil prices make economic diversification and long-term growth easier, not more difficult. It is bad for short-term growth. It's always a short-term shock to the economy, but in the long term, diversification is easier because there are macroeconomic adjustment mechanisms and incentives that make it easier. It may sound counterintuitive for non-economists, but it has always been true for any oil and other resource-rich countries, that when the export revenues from extractive sectors decrease, this increases the breathing space, redresses level playing field for non-extractive sectors in the country, for especially tradable manufacturing, services to thrive. It creates more space for private entrepreneurship to challenge the market power of the state-owned incumbents, state-owned enterprises. Institutions become less reliant on extractive sectors. So as some economists say, institutions become less extractive. So governance becomes more transparent and accountable. So by and large, in the economic lingo, the resource curse gets reversed and the Dutch disease gets healed when the oil prices and resource prices are low. So there is a mixture of kind of good and bad news for diversification coming from the crisis. But the real question that we struggle with is whether that diversification in the post-COVID-19 period will be green or brown. And why does this color coding matter now more than ever for the oil-dependent countries? So if you look at the history and the graph that I asked, that is shown here, is taken from our December last year publication of Gulf Economic Update, when we focus especially about economic diversification for environmentally sustainable and resilient GCC. So as you can see, most of the Gulf countries have made important strides towards diversification beyond hydrocarbon revenues. Bahrain has already over 80% of GDP generated by non-oil sectors. And the share of non-oil GDP in UAE has expanded to 70%, remains quite low, over 40% in Saudi Arabia. But before COVID, the diversification has been mainly brown, and that's sometimes overlooked in the diversification debate. This graph here shows how the export shares of different sectors changed during the period 2013-2017. So what we see here is that indeed in most countries except Kuwait, the share of oil revenues in the total exports have decreased. However, that has been often offset by the increase of the export share of the heavy industries, often downstream industries that use this oil and gas at home. So what happened was that the diversification was on the path that nationalized or localized a lot of emissions that have been previously exported with oil. So GCC countries have diversified or made important progress with diversification, but it's a traditional diversification beyond oil, but into related industries that thrive mainly through thanks to the low energy and emission prices at home. Now, if I can ask for the second slide, the question is, whether this traditional diversification that adds value to oil downstream can increase the country's resilience to revenue volatility and the typical cyclical shocks that these countries and many other resource countries have been struggling with in the past. And I think the answer is, if it's done right, yes, it can hedge the traditional risks. But the question that I think more and more people around the world are asking is whether the shocks of the future are going to be similar to the shocks of the past. And the question is, will such diversification really hedge the risks of the more secular transformation in the global oil markets and the secular transformation in the global economic structure? So as the world goes green, how this diversification hedge the new sorts of economic, hedge the risks of the new economic impacts. So in the book that we have just published a couple of weeks ago on the climate strategies for fossil fuel dependent countries, we looked at the strategies that fossil fuel dependent countries can play in this world that's likely to go low carbon, that's likely to see more and more green technology disruptions, that is already seeing shifts in consumers and investor preferences towards products and services with low environmental footprint, that we see regulations percolating around the world on product standards, and maybe also the trade measures that may limit market access and lower prices for tradable products with high environmental and carbon impacts. Now, in this graph, we kind of mapped the preparedness of different fossil fuel dependent countries to these new impacts of low carbon transition that I had just mentioned. So the conclusion for the Gulf countries is that most of them belong to the countries that are among the most exposed to the low carbon transition. And we've developed a complex index of exposure and resilience. You can look for the details in the book, but they are among the most exposed, but also relatively resilient to the shocks, due to the fact that, compared to countries like Libya or Iraq, Gulf countries are more sophisticated, more advanced. They have more accumulated resources from the past extractions and so forth and so forth. So the question is, whether going forward, that diversification and recovery in the Gulf countries will reduce exposure to these new sorts of external impacts and further increase resilience. So the next slide sheds some light on it, which is that the diversification going forward can remain brown. Well, we call it traditional diversification, or become more greener. And the difference is that the diversification that stays brown is a comfort zone for resource-rich countries. It builds on the current capabilities, skills, accumulated capital stock. So it's not easy to change. It hedges the cyclical risks if done well, but as I have said, it increases the exposure and reduces resilience to these new types of secular transformation in the global fossil fuel markets. And also, it's increases, for instance, exposure to border adjustment taxes, to trade sanctions, as I have mentioned. So the new path of diversification, which is not new to the Gulf countries, we see a lot of elements of this new diversification paradigm that we call asset diversification, which is basically diversifying a portfolio of assets on which the country relies to generate sustainable income. And it pays much more attention to human capital and renewable natural capital, including not only energy, but many ecosystem services on which economy depends. It has a potential to discover completely new comparative advantages that are beyond the comfort zone of the oil value chain and can make the economies prosperous, competitive, and sustainable in the world that is going greener. So the COVID response, I think, showed us so far that economic resiliency and flexibility has been underrated so far in our economic thinking and theories. So asset diversification is predicated on more knowledge-intensive, more productivity-driven growth that also makes the economy more resilient, more flexible, more easy to adapt to the future shocks that can be related to what Aisha was saying, external, climate, physical impacts of climate change, collapse of domestic and ecosystem services related to water, related to biodiversity, coastal areas. But the most important thing is it really hedges the risk and makes the economy more resilient and more ready to these risks that central bankers in Europe call the transition risk, where the rest of the world is transitioning to a completely new economy, which is much more low carbon and much more environmentally sustainable. So, summing up, pandemic triggers stress response measures. And under stress, people in general and resource-rich countries in particular often prefer to stay in their comfort zone. And in this case, the comfort zone is brown diversification. It creates jobs that are familiar through familiar business models. It builds on familiar skills, familiar capabilities. Even if these jobs are exposed to the risks that they can become stranded together with the capital that supports it going forward. So the answer to your question is that COVID shock is likely, I think, to make brown diversification easier than green. And it will be a challenge to use stimulus to go beyond comfort zone and really build the foundations for the new sustainable economy of the future. But the leaders and the people in the Gulf countries have already shown several times in the past that they can be visionary, that they can think long-term while taking care of the immediate needs of their people. So again, the challenge that we are facing now in the Gulf, I think, is to make the recovery and resulting diversification serving long-term sustainability and resilience and prosperity of jobs in the world of the future, which is most likely to be very different than the world that we know from the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregor. Let's pull some threads from your speech. It's very interesting to hear, and I totally understand the propensity to move towards brown diversification. It's a source of competitive advantage for these countries for a long time, their energy resources and access to inexpensive energy. But Mary, let's come back to you and let's talk about some of the strongest opportunities for green investment. What sorts of green investments and green diversification are these countries looking at right now? They focused on renewable energy? Are they looking at actions outside the energy industry? What are the main things that they're looking at today?
Thank you, Samantha. I do agree with Gregor's assessment that the Gulf countries are very much still in the comfort zone. In sort of thinking about this question, as I said earlier, I think the starting point is that the GCC countries haven't yet spelled out really in any major way a new economic vision to come out of the crisis. As Aisha said, we've had a number of countries that have done that and can afford to do that, like the EU, like South Korea, whereas in the other end of the spectrum, we have small island states, countries in Africa, LDCs, including in the Arab region, who are struggling to keep their people fed at the moment and are struggling under unsustainable debt burdens. So we have a huge variety of capacities around the world. And I think in this sense, the 6 GCC countries still are situated in the sort of more capable end of the sphere. And so I'll get back to that in a bit. What we have seen so far are some indications. One, the UAE government, for example, held a meeting in May, preceding a major government reshuffling, which saw a lot of streamlining, also an indication of changes to come. And that meeting focused on a few priority areas. Interestingly enough, food security was among them. This is, of course, a major concern. The Gulf countries are very food import dependent. And we've seen already some shipments of cows coming in as a result. So that's a huge emphasis. Education also was on the list, as was health, of course, and the economy by and large. I think there's lots of interesting examples to tell about Saudi Arabia that can give an indication on whether the existing plans are still on track and anything green. So here, for example, as you know, Saudi Arabia is the G20 president this year. We've heard the Saudi promote its circular carbon economy concept in a very big way this year. And I think it's very interesting, having followed Saudi Arabia and the climate negotiations for a very long time. This is the latest or I think the best so far Saudi sort of pitch to have the hydrocarbons included in the solution, and the bigger solution in a move towards a decarbonized world. And it includes things like CCS and other forms of carbon sequestration. But also we've heard broader and more sort of mainstream green signals coming out of Saudi Arabia this year. It's just announced the world's biggest green hydrogen plant, which is a 5 billion facility. And hydrogen is a topic that's received a lot of hype and attraction this year in the global energy sort of world. And for the GCC countries, it has its obvious appeal because it can be made green through renewable energy, and hydrogen can be stored and transported. So it has a lot of similarities to oil and gas in many ways. So who knows, we came from stones and or the stone age metaphor, and oil is not going to run out. We're going to need it less. So perhaps hydrogen might be something on the horizon. But big investments will be needed, of course. In Saudi, of course, we also have the mega project NEOM, which has its green dimensions, and that seems to be moving forward as planned. And the energy ministers recently come out saying that the country might aim at a 50% solar capacity by 2030, which is pretty ambitious. The UAE, which has traditionally been very big, they bought onto the green growth debate and the concept coming out of the 2009 crisis in a very big way. Had a green agenda here, a green economy agenda, and then subsequently to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. The UAE has been very actively positioning itself as a regional pioneer in integrating the SDGs in its development strategies, or aligning its development strategy with the SDGs. Even so, we haven't yet heard anything from the UAE, and I think this is probably a premature point now to be making any judgments on whether these might be coming or not. We simply don't know. I think it's too early to say. But what do we know? Or what do we know about the opportunities? So the Oxford University study that Aisha mentioned looked at indeed things that tick 3 boxes: economic returns, jobs, and climate benefits. And I just wanted to summarize a few of them and then briefly speak about how Gulf countries are faring in these areas. The top one was clean energy infrastructure and clean R&D, followed by connectivity infrastructure investments specifically related to electric vehicles, so EV infra, and 5G as well. Education and R&D spending are also areas where you can generate a lot of climate benefits, according to this study, which was based on a survey of a large number of G20 finance stakeholders. And energy efficiency in buildings also came very high, ticking all these 3 boxes. So what do we know already? The GCC renewable energy projects, as much as I've seen, they seem to be proceeding as planned. although so are some hydrocarbon projects. There's a major gas plant in one of the GCC countries that's also just given a go-ahead, which is, I mean, inevitable. But if we really want to save the planet from dangerous global warming, this is not the way to go. And the current targets are not also, unfortunately, they're not ambitious enough, so more is needed. I did a quick calculation today based on IRENA data, and I came up with this number. If the GCC countries meet their current renewable energy targets, by 2030, they'll reduce their emissions by 10% compared to 2016 levels. And as we know, the emission trajectories in the GCCs are still currently on the rise. And if we want to stay below 2 degrees of global warming, globally, emissions should fall between 2020 and 2030, the next decade, by 25%. So you can do the math on that. GCC countries are still, they have not emphasized a lot, not put a lot of emphasis on electric vehicles, Dubai perhaps being one exception. And sectors where recovery, or which have been hit a lot harder and where recovery will take a lot longer, which include tourism, aviation, and construction. These are the sectors where a lot of jobs have been lost and will be lost. But these are also the sectors where green stimulus measures and packages would really make sense, in addition to things like EV infrastructure and sustainable public transport. Education and e-learning has received a lot of attention here as well, and R&D to some extent. But obviously a lot more could be done. There's a lot more potential. And referring again to the study that Aisha also mentioned, or the report by Bloomberg, which found that so far $12 trillion globally have been committed to the recovery, and 0.2% of that is green. The same article points out, however, although some of the stimulus is already locking in carbon-intensive trajectories, including in aviation in Europe, very few of the aviation bailouts have had any climate-related conditionalities. In the Gulf, there are huge bailouts. We don't know the numbers, but I wouldn't believe that there would be any conditionalities associated either. There's a lot of lock-in that's already happened, unfortunately. But now we're coming out of this rescue phase and we're going into the economic recovery phase. Now is the time, in the coming months, now is the last, or the window of opportunity to actually think big and think visionary. So now it's time, and the challenge is, as pretty much anywhere else in the world, that the momentum of greening in the Gulf, it's there. But it's not moving fast enough. There's a lot of ambition, but it's not moving fast enough. And it's not transformative, which is most important. Going back to what Grzegorz was saying about diversification being brown, not green, the investments are not transformative. And in this regard, however, I want to end on a happy note. So I'm carefully optimistic that in the coming months, we will get some good news from the GCC countries. If I were asked to bet, I would bet on the UAE and Saudi Arabia for some good news, for two reasons. The UAE, it's got a big track record on positioning itself as a leader in the region in sustainability. And Saudi Arabia, because the ambition, the scale of the ambition of its economic diversification vision is simply so big. And because of what I just cited of examples of Saudi actually thinking of betting now on renewables and thinking about competitiveness in a lower carbon world. Having said that, I think finally, this is, as I've been saying, this is the year of the government. In the Gulf, the private sector was always weaker than in many other regions, but even more than ever, government now is in the driving seat. And that is the same for climate change. So both COVID-19 and climate change need government ambition, and they need a big government vision. And that's what I'm really hoping that we'll see in the coming months.
Thank you, Mary. I would like to grab a thread from your discussion about government being in the driver's seat, which is typically the case in the Gulf countries, frankly. But I'd like to turn to Gregor for a minute and talk a minute about the incentives for green investments in GCC countries and whether or not the policy environment encourages green private investment. The government is more involved in the economy in the GCC states than in many places that we're used to. However, the real dollars are actually in the private sector. I'd like to bring in a question that came in on the chat as well, and that is about utility diversification and whether that has the opportunity to attract private investment, as we've seen in the renewable sector in Abu Dhabi.
Yeah, thank you, Samantha. So, first of all, I think it's important to highlight and stress that all the Gulf countries have made very important economic and regulatory reforms recently to improve business climate, to improve the environment for their investments. I mean, the recent draft FDI law in Saudi Arabia is state of the art. Fingers crossed it will get implemented. Bahrain, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia are made it to the list of the top 10 global improvers in doing business report. So a lot of business reforms, a lot of market creation have been ongoing for the last few years, and I think is now will benefit the COVID response abilities in the Gulf countries big time. And having said that, I think most of the GCC countries, although they pursue several elements of this broader asset diversification, they are still kind of locked in the economic structure and regulatory incentives and price incentives that sends very confusing signals to markets. Ambitious renewable energy projects are, attract a lot of attention, but at the same time, for instance, Saudi Arabia Vision 2030 has a very ambitious program to increase the local content of the oil and gas sectors from 40 to 75%. And, more resources go to that program than to renewable energy. And renewable energy is important, but not a really major part of the story, because a country cannot bet long-term growth on producing electricity. It will not be a major export commodity. Yeah, it will not be a major revenue earner. And it will make the domestic industry more green, hence more competitive and more resilient to external shocks going forward. But nonetheless, the key question is, whether these regulatory incentives really will address the issue of industrial diversification and what kind of industry it will incentivize. And I'd like to just, there are many opportunities, and Mari has mentioned many of them already. Many issues that are coming out in the discussion in the Gulf countries and their partners. Carbon capture and storage is one important, and I think when Saudis are getting serious about carbon capture and storage, especially the storage part, as their contribution to the global efforts to stabilize climate, I mean, let's take it. We need everybody on this bandwagon, and we need all contributions, especially knowing that countries will contribute in the way that is most suitable to them and in a way in which they are good at. And actually, many countries in the Gulf are good at drilling and managing underground storages. So if they can offer the service to the world, let the world take it, seriously and create a demand for such services. With CCS, we are in the place where we were with renewables in 2004, 2005. High costs, low demand. And, we need the global effort to change it. And we need it for not only a 1.5 degree trajectory, but we need a lot of CCS for the 2 degree trajectory. All models show it. Now, the other opportunity is with the fiscal rules. So in the current environment of high fiscal deficit, increasing borrowing, although still quite sustainable in the Gulf countries, going forward, there will be a pressure for fiscal consolidation in the recovery stage, but as well as the pressure not to contract expenditures too often, too early and too much in order not to choke off recovery. So Saudi Arabia has already increased the VAT rates to make up the revenue, to increase the revenue, domestic revenue in order to control fiscal deficit. I think going forward, the opportunities to use energy taxes, increase water pricing, increase waste management pricing in order to avoid increasing direct income taxes will be a big opportunity for the Gulf countries, both to improve the fiscal space for the long-term recovery, as well as create these incentives within the countries for more green and more broader diversification. And the last story is about the circularity. There's a lot of talk about circular economy, but look at the example of SABIC in Saudi Arabia. When SABIC developed this cutting-edge technology of chemical recycling, they didn't invest and create jobs in the Gulf countries. They went to the Netherlands and they are building a big plant there because Europe has created a regulatory incentive for recycled content of plastic products. Such incentives do not exist in the Gulf countries. So skills, financial capabilities, and capital that could be invested in the Gulf to create jobs and all these technology spillovers in the economy are migrating to where the regulatory incentives are more convenient. I think it's a lesson learned for the Gulf going forward. Maybe I'll stop at that because we are running out of time.
Yeah, we are running short on time, but I think it's just because everyone has so much to say. It's such an interesting topic. I'll pose the next question to Aisha, but I think what I'll do is then bring it back to Mary and Gregor as sort of a wrap up, so that you guys have a chance to comment on a broader question. But I'd like to think about some of the similarities between COVID and climate. One of our questions came in describing the climate issue as a green swan. I've also heard issues like this described as black rhinos. They're, rather than a black swan, it's actually something that's very dangerous, but also predictable. We saw or should have seen this coming. How are governments and publics dealing with these actually predictable problems? How are they merging their long-term and short-term vision? And are they bringing the general population on board in dealing with these problems, or do they maybe not need to because of the monarchical form of government? So just, are they seeing the similarities between COVID and climate? Are they bringing the population on board, and how are they merging long-term and short-term views of this? So Aisha, let's start with you. This is a broad question, but it might be a good wrap up to bring everyone's thoughts together.
Right, so it's a really good question. It's more about the engagement of the population and whether we do see any bottom-up movement to address the climate-related issues. Well, I think yesterday or the day before, I put a tweet on my Twitter account, and I was asking a general question: what do you feel about if you see the climate-related issues like the forest fires? And I tweeted it in Arabic, and just I wanted to see the impression of the people in the Gulf and how do they feel about the impacts of the climate change. And I think I got like 90% of the people feel negatively about it. So yes, there is the question of to what extent is the population engaged with the climate-related issues, and whether they push for example, investments on the renewables. And this is something we also discuss here in CAPSR. So, so there is a lot going on in the region. I can see, like, for example, from the education curricula, here in the Gulf, there is an evolution and there is an amendment on the in terms of trying to include the science that's related to the renewable energy and the climate change in the education curricula. So that is one of the starting points to get the population engaged. And also, like, there are some documentary programs on the TV, so that is one also source of raising the awareness of the importance. But I think in practical terms, the government should play a very big role in how we can bring the population and in taking practical actions, or invest, for example, in the renewables. And I think at the time of the COVID, I think what the government can do, the government can, first of all, we need the intention. It wouldn't happen by itself. So we need, for example, to say, this is the money that we are spending on the economic recovery, and then we can decide how much of that money could go, for example, to green investments. And we should be, like, very specific on what are the policies measures, and we need to be specific on which sectors we want to tackle, because there are some sectors that can bring more value in terms of socio-economic values than others. So, for example, there are the buildings, there are the transport, there is the electricity sector. And I see there is a lot of opportunities in there to invest in, I would speak about the energy efficiency, because the energy efficiency is the low-hanging fruit. And I think the government should take the opportunity to encourage the youth to be engaged in this process by creating the appropriate incentives for them to, for example, establish their own company, to be engaged with the small, medium enterprises, to invest in, for example, in the renewable or the energy efficiency, because there are too many opportunities along the value chain. But that wouldn't happen by itself. The government should play a strong role in that. So this is my impression.
Thanks. I'd like to come to Mary next, and then we'll come to Gregor just for some closing thoughts. On this kind of overarching question, are publics in the GCC seeing the similarities between the climate and the COVID crises and pushing their governments to do more? Or, as one of our questioners asked, does it matter given the form of government? And so I'll open it up to the two of you for closing comments.
Sure. Thanks, Samantha. So on this first question of similarities, I think the big link here, the biggest link of all, is that this is now our last opportunity. COVID has created an opportunity, a very unfortunate one, but the last one to shift trajectories. That's the biggest link in my mind to climate change. And whether we seize it or not is really, really very much up to the government, which takes me to the next question about awareness. I don't, my Arabic is not good enough to follow the Arabic speaking social media, so I fully trust Aisha on that. But on the English side, in my little Twitter bubble, yes, there's been quite a bit of talk about the linkages, whether that is a reflection of the public. I would say less so, because I follow the local English speaking media in the UAE very much. So not much debate on that. In terms of whether awareness is important, education is very important. There's very, very low awareness about climate change in this region, very low. And I've worked in an educational institution here with people doing their graduate degrees and not having very, very good knowledge on climate change to start with, let alone caring about it. And so these changes take a very long time. Of course, you need education, you need cultural change, you need awareness. But more importantly, right now, what you need is data for government. You need to link ministries and explain to them that they need to work together in this recovery. And we need data that shows in numbers the actual benefits of green recovery policies, of inclusive policies. This is what makes ministries work. We need the finance ministries on board. So in this sense, I would still think and this applies to all countries, not just the Gulf. The government really is in the driving seat now in deciding the course of travel. And it's much more about industrial policy than consumer choices. As we know, if you looked at the amount of emissions globally that were reduced during the worst lockdowns, which was maybe 8 or 9%, people were wondering, why is it so little? We're all sitting at our home, we're not doing anything, we're not moving anywhere, we're not traveling. This is because these are structural sources of emissions. You need to address these at the source. People can eat less meat. That's very important for a longer term transformation of the agricultural sector. We can fly less, which we're already doing, but it will not depend on the consumers. And the private sector will only act if the government puts in place the right incentives. And that applies anywhere. Here in particular, given the spending power that the governments have and the overall power they have. I can't resist very quickly answering to one of the questions, which says that one of the problem is that, quote, the climate change crowd seems to see this as an all or nothing solution, and that the person asking the question says that a mix of hydrocarbons and renewables is a more reasonable solution. Yes, it might be if we could change science, but unfortunately science does not negotiate. This is as simple as that. What we need is not a silver bullet. As we all know, we need a silver buckshot. So yes, I don't disagree with this speaker, this participant. Of course, we need hydrocarbons for now. We cannot switch them off, but we need to retire them at a really, really rapid speed. We cannot be building any more coal, and we should really be thinking about gas as well, because renewables are getting very, very cost competitive, which many countries are realizing. I really, really encourage you to look at an energy simulator. I'll put the link there while Greg does his remarks, called En-ROADS. It's by an initiative called Climate Interactive. They've developed it together with MIT, and it allows you to design your energy future, where you can see how a different energy mix takes you below 2 degrees or below 1.5 degrees. It's based on a huge amount of science, and there you will see that actually, if we want to stay below 2, if we're really serious globally, we will need carbon taxes, we will need early retirements of fossil fuel infrastructure, we will need coal, we will need to get rid of coal, we will need nuclear, we will need to transform our agricultural systems, we'll need a bit of deforestation, reforestation as well, and a lot less deforestation. We need a lot, we need everything. And that's why green recoveries also should not only focus on how much is renewable energy going to help us reduce emissions. We have to take a holistic approach. And this is really the opportunity, I think, for the Gulf as well.
Thank you very much. Yeah, with the climate being a cumulative system, and because we keep adding to it over time, the longer we wait, the more serious our actions need to be. And that's where we are right now. Gregor, would you like to bring us home?
Yeah, so, yeah, indeed. I mean, the main difference between climate change and COVID is that climate change is like a COVID crisis on steroids, and it's permanent and cumulative rather than one-off and repetitive. You know, for me, what is really important in the logic of the architecture of the Paris Agreement and this global effort to do something about it is that the self-interest of the individual countries and communities have to be aligned with the interest of the global community. And that, from this perspective, I think that I actually kind of agree with the comment that we need both hydrocarbons and renewables, but we need them as a transition during the transition period. Because especially in the countries that are dependent on current revenues that come from the hydrocarbon sectors and they come from the related downstream industries, I mean, you cannot just drop it off and leave it in the ground tomorrow, because then you are left with no resources to diversify, with no resources to transform. So you need to have a transition period. That's why I think it's gonna be so challenging to manage this short-termism that is triggered by the COVID responses with this long-term vision of building the transition towards a different economy that is more sustainable to the future challenges, global challenges. And for me as an economist, I think incentives are the key. We do need new social norms. I agree with that. We need new awareness. We need new social contracts, which currently depends on the expectation of low energy, water, and other kind of utility prices. But we need incentives. And in the end of the day, it's a responsibility of the entire world. And I think that the countries that are importing GCC, hydrocarbons, and industrial products are kind of rising up to the awareness that they will need to create some incentives for the fossil fuel dependent countries to get on board with the global efforts to decarbonize economies. And you know, we see growing discussions about border taxes. We see a lot of movements on product standards that restrict market access for unsustainable goods and services. And if that incentives are in place, or even anticipating their probability, you know, I think the prudent economic policy and strategy need to take these worst case scenarios from their perspective into account. That's the basics of decision making under uncertainty. Because I do believe we have uncertainty, and if we want to be prepared for the uncertain future, we need to look at the plethora of scenarios, including the worst case scenarios, including the best case scenarios, and have a flexible economy that can adjust and respond to the new green, black, brown, whatever swans are coming our way. That's why this asset diversification is so important and needs to be embedded in the incentive structure, regulatory pricing, market. And the last comment is that such diversification and such future will not be driven by the state-owned firms. I mean, the state-owned companies make it virtually impossible for economies to innovate their way out of the crisis. It needs to be based on private sector entrepreneurship to challenge the coming incumbents. I stop at that.
Thank you so much. I've run over time, but I think it's because it's such an interesting topic and because our speakers have so much to say. So I want to thank all of our speakers for joining us today. I want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us, for your excellent questions. And I want to thank our colleagues at AGSIW for putting this on. So with that, I'd like to wrap up the panel. Raymond, I'm not sure if you have anything else you need to say at the end or whether we're finished.
Just to add my thanks to everyone who's joined us. Special thanks to you, Samantha, and to our speakers. Happy that we were able to contribute to this important conversation taking place in the region. Please feel free to reach out to us with any feedback or questions. We have, as I mentioned, we have more webinars planned in the coming weeks. So make sure to visit our website, agsiw.org, and sign up to our weekly newsletter for regular analysis and updates. And thank you all again.